Hi, my name is Marie Raboin, and I work for Dane County Land Conservation in South Central Wisconsin. I work as a conservation specialist, but my main job is that I work as the county's grazing specialist. So today we are going to talk about forage resource concerns as a TSP or a grazing specialist would go out to a field, work with a farmer, kind of assess what's going on, and then decide maybe what resource concerns or what steps we're going to take next to increase forage production. So today behind me are a group of cows, but also back in the distance we'll see some permanent pasture, and then we're standing in a crop field. So one of the things that I always think about when first approaching a farmer about, their interest in managed grazing or permanent pastures, what do they have currently for pasture? How are they managing it? Do they want to expand it? Why do they want to expand it? You've got to listen to what they have to say first and then react to the situation, and also making sure that you're really cognizant of their current management level and not taking them 3 steps forward. It's really important to just meet people where they're at and then slowly build up management as you go. So one of the things I always tell people right off the bat, because everyone's so nervous about grazing and their current forage condition or what they're doing wrong, is I always say with grazing, there's no fatal flaws with grazing. You can really screw something up one year, and honestly, you're not going to screw it up so bad that it's not going to bounce back on you the following year. I mean, we definitely have seeding failures, and there's things that happen that are out of our control, but for the most part, we really can't screw it up too bad. So if you're going into an existing pasture, like the one up on the hill behind me, the first thing to notice is how low has that producer allowed the cows to graze the grasses? And then you can kind of go in there, and if it's low, you're probably looking at white clover and bluegrass if it's an existing pasture. Then you have to decide, do they want to actually increase forage production in that pasture? And if they do, that's when you step back and say, okay, my rule of thumb is that you are managing the grasses in your pasture for your most desirable species. So if you really want an orchard grass, meadow fescue, red clover stand, then you need to really give those grasses a break and understand that their growing point is a little bit further up. Another question that we'll often get as grazing specialists or TSPs is everyone wants to know how many cows per acre they can really sustain on their farm. And that question always gets me, because it depends, and it's the worst answer you want to give someone. But the truth is you can make any system work as long as you're willing to manage it in a way that you're preserving the integrity of the grass stand. So you could put 20 cows on 10 acres, but you need to understand that there's going to be times of year that you don't have enough grass and you're pulling them off and feeding them some hay. That doesn't mean that you can't have that many animals. It means that you're managing your pasture differently. And so someone asking for a dairy herd, it goes back to well, what do you want to feed them in the barn? And then we go back and look at an animal balance based on that farmer's management, their current situation. Some people have endless acres that they could use for pasture, where other people are really just limited by roads and fence lines and waterways. So what I like to say is anyone can do managed grazing. What our job is as a TSP is to help that person just get the animal balance right, and then also understand that animal balance in general is a total moving target. It's going to be different year in and year out depending on rainfall temperature. It's going to be different based on that particular farmer's management. And then it's also going to change over the years as those grasses and those pastures improve or degrade depending on the management. And so to just have a 2 acres per animal rule of thumb, you can kind of start there as a conversation, and I'd say always be conservative. I always say at least 2 acres because, someone's going to screw something up at some point, and it's better to have too much. No one has ever complained to me about having too much feed. Let's put it that way. So another thing to think about when you're thinking about a whole grazing system is, we do have an animal forage balance on the farm. It doesn't mean that every acre on the farm is accessible to grazing, but what it does mean is that the areas that you can pull additional forage. You do have some strategies for times of drought where you want to pull them off the pasture because we really don't want to stress our grasses and legumes out during times of drought. But then also, times of too much rain. It's a management practice. And then understanding that in Wisconsin, Minnesota, Illinois, Iowa, these places where we have pretty decent winters, is how are we managing those cattle in the winter when we don't have pasture? And some ways of thinking about that is, can you stockpile? Stockpiling can be tough because, is it close enough to the barn where they can come back for water? It's lovely to stockpile until you can't get water out to those cattle. Your other options are trying to maybe have alternative grasses or other areas like corn stover that you can at least put them out on in the winter. Maybe it's close enough to the barn where they have access to a frost-free water tank. But mainly what we want to do is not overgraze our pastures in the winter, because a lot of times you look at that and you're like, they could be out there another couple days, but all that's going to do is set you back in the spring. And there's nothing better than being the first guy out on grass in the spring. Let me tell you, the fact that you saved that grass or you gave that grass enough, photosynthesizing power to bounce back at the end of March when we get a warm up, and on April 10th you're out grazing already, that's a pretty sweet feeling. Another important question that you'll get is what to plant. And again, that's where walking the farm, talking to the farmer and seeing what they've grown before is also really helpful, because they're going to be a lot more confident in a grass that they've seen before in a hayfield or something they've tried out somewhere along the line. Really, it comes down to, is it on a dry hill or is it in a wetter, low area, where in reality is where we see most of our permanent pastures anyway. A great example is where I'm standing, the flat, lovely, good corn ground. These cows are on stover, but behind me where we see the hill go up, his permanent pasture is in his wet areas and in his higher, drier, droughty areas. So going back to what I talked about before is you're managing these pastures for what you consider to be your best forage variety. So like I said, if you're managing for orchard grass, you need to understand that then you have to leave a solid 6 inches of residual on that orchard grass, or it's just not going to come back. And the cows are always going to pick their favorites too. So you can choose your favorites as much as you want, but if they really like a certain species, that's what they're going to graze first, obviously, and they're going to graze it hardest, and then you need to realize what that species needs to recover. Another thing I would say, if we're looking at resource concerns, is definitely going to be brush management in our, I'll quote unquote, native pastures. Multiflora rose obviously is going to be the number one, I think, brush species we probably see. We can also see autumn olive, buckthorn coming in. On those, it's probably going to be a combination of mechanical, chemical treatment to just set those brush species back, and then also give those forages time to grow back in, where they've been shaded out. Another really important topic to touch on is just legumes and bloat. So farmers always want to put alfalfa into pastures. I get it. It's a crop they know. It's something they know yields well. It's pretty drought resistant. You can bank on it. However, alfalfa is also really tricky with bloat. I think in the spring, everyone's really nervous about it, and they take precautions to make sure cows don't bloat on alfalfa too early in the year when you get that really nice flush of first growth and cattle are susceptible. They're coming off of a dry feed. However, you do have to worry about bloat on alfalfa again in the fall, especially in some lower ground where you may not realize we got a frost the night before, and you wake up to something that you don't want to wake up to. And I'm seeing more of the grazers I work with shy away from or even eliminate alfalfa in their pastures because it's just one more thing to think about. So to conclude with forage resource concerns, we're going to look at, what the management currently is, what the goal of the producer is. Like, do they really want more forage? Do they want to increase pasture? What are their goals? Looking at species selection and then matching that really with their livestock. Is it dairy? Is it beef? That's going to make a big difference in protein and how much, what the quality needs to be on the pasture. It's going to affect the rotation itself, and then really focusing on, I think, for folks new to grazing or even just improving their current systems, is what's that infrastructure like, and how can we as TSPs or as grazing specialists get them the resources they need to, I always say, if I can do it, we want people to have Cadillac systems. Like, we want systems that work for them in their operation, for their equipment, and for their manpower, and just making sure that we're matching all those things up. I think we can probably alleviate a lot of overgrazing and make people realize that, like, you can't undergraze too. So that's not a thing.